Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
The silence on Orbital 6 was different from the silence of space. Space was vast and empty, a void that swallowed sound before it could begin. But the station's silence was heavy with the weight of absent voices, empty corridors that should have echoed with conversation, and workstations where no one sat anymore. Crane stood in the observation deck, watching the planet below through reinforced transparent steel. From here, it looked almost peaceful, swirls of brown and gray cloud cover hiding the devastation beneath. The coffee in his hands had gone cold hours ago, but he held on to the mug anyway. It was something to do with his hands, something that felt normal in a world where normal had become a luxury. The communications array behind him flickered with automated signals, routine maintenance reports, orbital mechanics calculations, the steady pulse of systems that continued functioning even when their operators had fled or died. He was supposed to monitor those signals, supposed to maintain the link between the orbital platforms and whatever remained of civilization below. But for the past week, there had been fewer and fewer responses to his transmissions, fewer voices answering when he called. The war was ending, everyone said. The question was, what would be left when it finally stopped? A soft chime drew his attention to the primary console. Incoming transmission from the surface. Weak signal, heavily distorted, but definitely human. Crane set down his mug and moved to the controls with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years turning loneliness into productivity. Orbital 6, this is Strike Team Gamma, requesting immediate medical evacuation. We have casualties. Repeat, we have... Static swallowed the rest of the message. Crane worked frantically with the signal processors, boosting gain and filtering interference. But the transmission was gone. Just another voice disappearing into the electronic void that had claimed so many others. He tried to re-establish contact, cycling through frequencies and broadcast patterns, but there was nothing. The silence returned, heavier than before. The duty roster on his wall showed names crossed out in red ink. Colleagues evacuated, reassigned, or simply gone. His own name sat at the bottom of a very short list, the last engineer still maintaining the station's essential systems. He told himself it was duty that kept him here, but late at night when the artificial gravity hummed and the recycling systems whispered, he wondered if it wasn't just fear of being alone somewhere else. At least here, surrounded by the familiar chaos of maintenance requests and orbital mechanics, he could pretend he was still useful, still part of something larger than himself. The planet below continued its slow rotation, keeping its secrets hidden beneath clouds and electromagnetic interference. Somewhere down there, people were fighting and dying and calling for help that might never come. Crane turned back to his console and began composing another general broadcast, adding his own voice to the electronic chorus that sang in the dark between worlds. Someone had to keep trying. Someone had to maintain the link, even if he was the only one left to listen for an answer. The acrid smoke stung Crane's eyes as he picked his way through the battlefield, his engineer's toolkit clanking against his hip with each careful step. The ground beneath his boots was a mixture of scorched earth and melted metal, still radiating heat from the plasma bombardment that had ended 3 hours ago. Bodies lay scattered like broken dolls, some human, others barely recognizable as the cybernetic horrors they'd become. The air tasted of copper and ozone, thick enough to coat his throat. He shouldn't have been here. Engineers from Orbital 6 were supposed to stay in the safe zones, repairing communications arrays and maintaining life support systems. But when the distress beacon had cut out mid-transmission, someone had to investigate. Someone always had to investigate. The crater stretched before him like a wound in the planet's flesh, easily 100 meters across and deep enough that the bottom disappeared into shadow. Steam rose from the edges where superheated rock met the planet's thin atmosphere. His scanner flickered erratically. Too much electromagnetic interference from the weapon discharge. He'd have to rely on his eyes and instincts. That's when he saw the glint of metal. At first he thought it was debris, another piece of shattered war machine to catalog and report. But as he scrambled down the crater's steep side, sending loose stones cascading ahead of him, the shape resolved into something more deliberate, more human. She was buried under a twisted beam of what had once been a defensive turret, her form barely visible beneath chunks of concrete and twisted metal. Her armor was a masterwork of battlefield engineering, each plate scarred by countless impacts but still maintaining its integrity. The helmet was cracked down one side, a spider web of fractures that somehow hadn't shattered completely. But she was breathing. The chest plate rose and fell in weak, irregular rhythms that seemed to echo the planet's own labored pulse. "Can you hear me?" Crane shouted, his voice echoing strangely in the crater's depths as he dropped to his knees beside her. His hands moved automatically to check for pulse points, training taking over where shock had momentarily frozen him. She flinched at his touch, her body jerking as if struck by electricity. Through the broken visor, he could see her eyes, bright green and filled not with the fear he expected, but with something far worse. Shame burned there like a dying star, consuming everything else. Her hand moved toward what looked like a combat knife sheathed at her side, but the motion was pitiful. Barely a twitch of fingers that seemed disconnected from any real strength. The effort left her gasping, and he heard the wet sound of fluid in her lungs. "Kill me," she whispered, the words so quiet he almost missed them over the settling debris around them. "Or leave." The words hit him like a physical blow. He'd heard them before, from other soldiers, other casualties of this endless war. But there was something different in her voice. Not the desperate plea of someone afraid to die, but the weary request of someone who had been carrying death for too long. He didn't leave. Instead, he began the careful work of excavation, moving debris piece by piece, checking constantly to ensure he wasn't causing more damage. His engineering background served him well here, understanding load distribution, stress points, the delicate balance of forces that kept the rubble from shifting catastrophically. Each piece he removed revealed more of her, more of the devastation she'd endured. When he finally cleared enough space to examine her properly, what he found made his breath catch in his throat. The armor was holding her together in ways that went beyond simple protection. Microservos hummed quietly, providing support where muscle and bone had failed. Bio-monitoring displays flickered along the inner surfaces, painting a grim picture of systemic failure. But it was her face, finally visible when he carefully lifted away the broken helmet, that stopped him completely. She was beautiful in the way that ancient statues were beautiful, carved by suffering into something timeless and terrible. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark veins visible beneath like cracks in marble. Her hair, matted with blood and debris, might once have been golden. "This wasn't from the battle," he said, more to himself than to her. "The wounds were too old, too systematic. This was decay from within, not damage from without." She turned her face away from him, as if his gaze was more painful than her injuries. "I'm Crane," he said, settling back on his heels and pulling a medical kit from his toolkit. "I'm an engineer from Orbital 6. Not a soldier, in case you were wondering. But if you want to die, you're out of luck. I'm not leaving you here." "Why?" The single word carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of abandonment. He paused in his work, hands stilling over the bandages. It was a fair question, one he wasn't sure he could answer adequately. Why risk his life for a stranger? Why stay when she'd given him explicit permission to leave? "Because you didn't ask for help," he said finally. "And that's the loudest cry for it I've ever heard." Moving her required careful planning and considerable improvisation. He couldn't risk using standard extraction protocols. Her condition was too fragile, the armor too integrated with her body's failing systems. Instead, he created a makeshift stretcher from debris and his own equipment, cushioning every surface with whatever fabric he could scavenge. The journey to shelter took nearly 2 hours, across terrain that seemed actively hostile to human life. The planet's twin suns beat down mercilessly, turning his work clothes into a sweat-soaked second skin. The air was thin enough to leave him gasping, and the constant threat of aftershocks from the bombardment made every step treacherous. He found sanctuary in what had once been a mining shaft, carved deep into the planet's bedrock and lined with enough shielding to block most forms of detection. The entrance was nearly invisible, hidden behind a curtain of hanging cables and twisted metal that had probably saved it from the worst of the fighting. Inside, the air was cooler and carried the faint hum of ancient machinery, still somehow functioning in the depths. Emergency lighting cast everything in an amber glow that made their shadows dance on the walls like ghosts of the dead above. He worked by that amber light, carefully removing pieces of her armor to assess the damage beneath. What he found defied easy categorization. Burns covered most of her torso, but they were old, months or maybe years healed. The blue veins he'd noticed in her face were more pronounced here, forming intricate patterns across her skin, like some alien calligraphy. Blood trickled from wounds that should have healed long ago, each drop the color of dark wine against her pale skin. But more disturbing was the way her muscles seemed to have wasted away, leaving her frame frighteningly fragile beneath the armor's bulk. "This isn't from battle," he said again, this time as a statement rather than an observation. "What happened to you?" She remained silent, watching him work with eyes that seemed to catalog every movement, every expression. There was intelligence there, and something else, a kind of predatory awareness that made him remember she was, despite everything, still a soldier. "I'm not going anywhere," he continued, cleaning and bandaging each wound with methodical precision. "So you might as well talk to me. Silence gets pretty loud down here." Still nothing, but he thought he saw something shift in her expression, the slightest softening around her eyes. "Look, I've got time," he said, settling back against a convenient piece of machinery. "More time than either of us probably has supplies for. So we can do this the easy way, where you tell me what's wrong so I can help. Or we can do it the hard way, where I make increasingly terrible guesses until you're so annoyed you have to correct me." That earned him what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Fine," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Serena. The armor isn't just protection, it's life support. What you see underneath, it's not battle damage. It's a disease. A gift from the old wars, passed down through blood and bone." Her words carried the weight of absolute certainty, the kind that came from living with truth too terrible to doubt. "It eats muscle tissue first, then moves to the organs. The heart usually goes last. Not because it's stronger, but because the body saves it for final moments. The armor monitors everything, compensates where it can, keeps me functional long enough to—" She trailed off, as if the rest was too obvious to say. "Long enough to what?" "Long enough to die with some semblance of dignity, or purpose, whichever comes first." Crane felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd seen battlefield diseases before, biological weapons that turned the body against itself. But this was different, more subtle, more cruel. A slow dissolution rather than a quick death. "But you keep fighting," he said. "Because no one can see what's underneath," she replied. "The armor hides the weakness, makes me appear strong, and strength is all that matters in war." "I can see it now." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. Her eyes were the green of deep ocean water, beautiful and utterly alien. "Yes," she said softly. "You can." They moved at dawn, when the planet's twin suns created enough glare to mask their heat signatures from orbital surveillance. The scorched valley stretched before them like a pathway through hell, its walls rising on either side in twisted formations of melted rock and metal. Crane supported her weight as they walked, his arm around her waist while she leaned heavily against his shoulder. The armor helped. Servos and micromotors took some of the burden, but he could feel how much effort each step cost her. Her breathing was labored despite the suit's atmospheric processors, and more than once he felt her stumble before the armor's balance systems caught her. But she walked, proud and unbroken, as if the very act of forward motion was a victory against whatever was consuming her from within. "The disease," she said during one of their frequent rest stops, "it's not random. It was designed, engineered to target specific genetic markers common in my people." "Your people?" "The Karnath clans. Our warriors. We're warriors. The distinction becomes meaningless when there aren't enough of us left to matter." Her voice carried a bitterness that went deeper than personal pain. "Someone decided we were too dangerous to exist, so they created something that would make us extinct slowly. Naturally, as if it were just bad luck rather than genocide." Crane felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard rumors of such weapons, biological agents targeted at specific populations, but hearing it from someone living through it was different, personal and terrible. "I led the assault on the weapons facility where it was created," she continued. "Thought maybe we could find a cure, or at least an explanation. Instead, I found only more questions, and confirmation that whoever did this to us was very, very thorough." They walked in silence for a while, picking their way through debris fields and crater chains that painted a picture of a systematic destruction. This hadn't been a battle. It had been an execution. "The wounds that are killing me aren't from weapons," she said eventually. "They're from within, from a body that's been taught to destroy itself cell by cell, system by system." Her voice took on a distant quality, as if she were speaking from somewhere far away. "I can still see their faces, you know. My strike team, 37 of the best warriors our clans had ever produced." She paused, her breathing becoming more labored. "I led them into that facility believing we were going to destroy the source of our people's suffering. Instead, we walked into a trap so perfect it might have been designed specifically for us." Crane felt her weight shift against him, heard the soft whir of her armor's stabilizers compensating for her trembling. The facility was already evacuated when we arrived. Empty corridors, powered-down systems, nothing but abandoned research data and biological samples. But we found the production chambers, vast tanks where they had cultivated the pathogen that was killing us. For a moment I thought we had won. Her laugh was bitter as poisoned water. The containment breach wasn't an accident. It was the trap's final mechanism. As soon as we entered the primary laboratory, automated systems began pumping aerosolized versions of every strain they had developed into the air. 37 variants, each one designed to attack a different aspect of Karnath physiology. She stopped walking entirely, her armor's servos whining softly as they supported her full weight. I watched my warriors die one by one. Some lasted hours, others mere minutes. The strongest fell first. Their immune systems turned against them, with such violence that they tore themselves apart from within. "But you survived," Crane said softly. "Commander Voss made sure of that," she replied, her voice flat with old pain. "When it became clear that the mission was lost, when the pathogen began taking hold, he made a choice. He sealed me in a quarantine pod and ejected me from the facility before it went critical." Crane could hear something breaking in her voice, decades of guilt and shame finally finding release. "He told me I was the mission's only hope, that someone had to survive to warn our people, to carry the knowledge of what had been done to us. But I knew the truth." Her helmet turned toward him, and he could see tears tracking down her face behind the cracked visor. "He saved me because I was already infected, because letting me live was crueler than letting me die. You don't know that." I felt the change beginning, even as the pod carried me away from the explosion. The first symptoms, the muscle weakness. The way my heart began to struggle against something it couldn't fight. He knew I would suffer. He knew I would die slowly, carrying the knowledge of my failure like a second disease. She resumed walking, but her movements were mechanical now, driven by armor systems rather than will. "I should have stayed with my warriors, should have died beside them instead of fleeing like a coward. But you didn't flee," Crane said, his voice fierce with conviction. "You survived. You carried the message. You kept fighting even when your body was destroying itself. But you don't give up," he continued. She was quiet for so long he thought she hadn't heard him. Then, "Because giving up means they win. And I've seen too many friends die to hand them that victory cheaply. But also because..." She paused, and when she spoke again her voice was barely a whisper. "Because Commander Voss was wrong. I wasn't the mission's only hope. I was its greatest failure. And failures don't get to rest until they find some way to balance the scales." "I see you," he said simply. She stopped walking, turning to look at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper and more complex. "Yes," she said after a long moment, "you do." Night brought its own dangers. The planet's ecosystem had been shattered by the bombardment, driving survivors of all species into desperate scavenging. Some were merely hungry. Others had agendas that went beyond simple survival. Crane heard them coming before he saw them. The soft scrape of boots on stone, the metallic whisper of weapons being drawn. His engineering background hadn't included combat training, but it had taught him to think systematically about problems and solutions. The mind he cobbled together from his toolkit components wouldn't have impressed any military engineer, but it didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to create enough light and noise to blind and disorient anyone coming down the narrow passage they'd chosen for shelter. The signal flares were even simpler. Basic chemical reactions that would create bright lights at irregular intervals, making it impossible for attackers to judge their actual position in the darkness. But it was the light decoys that he was most proud of. Small devices that projected holographic silhouettes on the cave walls, complete with simulated movement and heat signatures. Not sophisticated enough to fool military scanners, but perfect for desperate scavengers with improvised equipment. When the attack came, it came fast and brutal. 3 figures in mismatched armor, carrying weapons that looked like they'd been assembled from battlefield salvage. Trophy hunters, most likely. The kind of predators that followed in the wake of major battles, collecting souvenirs from the dead and dying. Serena moved like liquid death despite her condition, her blade appearing in her hand as if summoned from thin air. Her movements weren't the precise, economical strikes of a healthy warrior. They were rougher, more desperate. But each one found its target with lethal efficiency. One of the attackers managed to pin Crane against the rock wall, a jagged piece of metal pressed against his throat hard enough to draw blood. He could smell the man's breath, rank with starvation and desperation. Could see the fever-bright madness in his eyes. Then Serena was there, launching herself between them with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. She took the attacker's return strike on her armor, the impact producing a sound like breaking thunder. But she drove her blade deep, ending the threat even as the effort drove her to her knees. When it was over, when the echoes of violence had faded into silence, Crane could hear the sound of her armor's systems struggling to compensate for new damage. Warning lights flickered along the inner surfaces, and he thought he could hear something grinding where it should have hummed smoothly. "You don't have to protect me," he said, helping her to her feet and checking the integrity of her suit's seals. "And you don't have to save someone who's dying," she replied, but there was no heat in it, just a kind of weary acknowledgement. "Maybe I do," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and he thought he saw something shift in her expression. A wall coming down, perhaps, or a door opening just a crack. "Maybe you do," she agreed quietly. The observation post had been abandoned for months, maybe years, but its basic structure was sound, and more importantly, it was well hidden among the rocky outcroppings that crowned this particular hill. From here they could see for kilometers in every direction, plenty of warning if anyone else decided to hunt them. Inside, Crane worked to make her comfortable while her armor's medical systems ran their endless diagnostics. He fashioned compresses from torn clothing, gave her water from his recycling system, told her stories from his life on the orbital stations to distract her from the pain. He talked about the artificial sunrises they programmed into the station's lighting systems, about the hydroponic gardens where he'd learned to appreciate the simple miracle of growing things in sterile environments. He told her about his mother, who had sung him to sleep with ancient lullabies that somehow survived the journey between stars. And slowly, carefully, he sang one of those lullabies now, a simple melody about sailors finding safe harbor after storms. His voice was nothing special, rough from too much recycled air and not enough practice, but it filled the silence between them with something that wasn't pain or fear. She laughed. It was a small sound, barely more than an exhale, but it transformed her face completely. For just a moment, he could see past the warrior's mask to the woman underneath. Someone who might have danced at festivals or argued with friends over trivial things or fallen asleep reading books that had nothing to do with death. "You're a strange man, Crane from Orbital 6, she said, and her voice carried notes he hadn't heard before. Warmth, maybe, or something that might become warmth given time. "You're a stubborn warrior, Serena of the Karnath clans," he replied. The smile faded from her face like a candle being snuffed. "I'm no longer a warrior. Warriors fight. Warriors protect their people. I'm just wearing a warrior's skin while everything underneath rots away." He moved closer to her, his hands steady as he reached for the armor's release mechanisms. She didn't stop him as he carefully removed the outer shell of her chest plate, revealing the scarred but warm skin beneath. The damage was extensive, networks of surgical scars overlaying the blue vein patterns of her disease. But underneath it all, he could feel the steady rhythm of her heart, strong despite everything trying to stop it. "To me," he said quietly, "you're still the strongest person I've ever met." She leaned against his shoulder then, her weight settling against him like trust made manifest. They sat in silence, watching the alien constellations wheel overhead through the observation post's cracked windows. Dawn brought new terrors. The drones appeared as distant specks against the morning sky, their flight patterns too regular to be natural scavengers. These were military units, old, automated sentries left over from the war, still following their original programming years after their creators had moved on to other battles. One of them began tracking their position, its sensors painting them with targeting beams that made Crane's skin crawl. The crimson light swept across his chest like the touch of death itself, and he could hear the high-pitched whine of charging weapon systems. "It's locked onto us," Serena said, her voice tight with recognition. "Hunter-killer model. They don't stop until their target is eliminated." "I've seen these before," Crane replied, his mind racing through possibilities. "Worked on captured units back on the station. They're powerful but not creative. If I can get it to follow me into that ravine..." "That's suicide. Those weapons will cut you apart before you make it halfway." "Not if I time it right." He was already moving, scrambling toward the narrow passage that cut deep into the hillside. "The ceiling's unstable. If I can bring it down at the right moment..." The drone followed him with mechanical precision, its targeting systems painting him with multiple laser sights as he dove into the passage's mouth. The walls closed around him like a stone throat, barely wide enough for his shoulders, with loose rocks raining down from the unstable ceiling above. Behind him, he could hear the whine of energy weapons charging to full power. The drone was hesitating at the passage entrance, its sensors probably detecting the structural instability. But its programming wouldn't let it give up the hunt. "Come on," Crane muttered, pressing himself against the passage wall as the targeting beam swept past his face. "Follow protocol. Pursue and eliminate." The drone entered the passage with mechanical determination, its bulk scraping against the narrow walls. Sparks flew as its armor plating caught on protruding rocks, and Crane could hear the servos in its limbs straining against the confined space. This was the moment. Crane triggered the improvised explosive he'd planted at the passage's narrowest point. A crude device cobbled together from his engineering supplies, but positioned with mathematical precision to bring down the maximum amount of ceiling material. The explosion was smaller than he'd expected, but the chain reaction it triggered was catastrophic. The entire passage ceiling collapsed in a thunderous avalanche of stone and debris, filling the narrow space with choking dust and the screaming of tortured metal. But Crane had misjudged the blast radius. The shock wave caught him as he tried to scramble clear, lifting him off his feet and slamming him against the passage wall with bone-jarring force. Then the debris was falling around him. Chunks of stone the size of his head, twisted metal fragments that glowed red-hot from the explosion. Something sharp and burning caught him in the leg, tearing through muscle and scraping against bone. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, driving coherent thought from his mind and replacing it with animal panic. He could feel blood soaking through his clothes, could smell the copper tang of it mixing with dust and ozone. The world tilted sideways and went dark. When consciousness returned, it came slowly and painfully. Crane found himself lying in filtered sunlight, his leg throbbing with each heartbeat. But worse than the pain was the sight that greeted him when he opened his eyes. Serena knelt beside him, but she was wearing her full armor again. Every plate sealed, the helmet locked in place, the visor dark and impersonal. After hours of gradual intimacy, of seeing the woman beneath the warrior's shell, having her hidden again felt like a betrayal. "Why?" he whispered, trying to sit up despite the screaming protest from his injured leg. "Because you were unconscious for 6 hours," she replied, her voice filtered and mechanical through the suit's speakers. "Because I had to drag you out of that rock fall piece by piece, and some of those pieces were still glowing hot from the explosion. Because..." Her voice broke, and he could hear something raw and unguarded beneath the electronic distortion. "Because I've never been so terrified in my life," she continued. "When I saw you disappear under all that stone, when I thought you were dead, I remembered what it felt like to lose everyone I cared about, and I couldn't bear to feel that again." She had worked for hours to extract him from the debris, her armor's servos straining against rocks that would have been impossible to move by hand. Some of the larger pieces had required improvised leverage, metal beams wedged against stone, fulcrums created from twisted wreckage, the patient application of engineering principles to the messy business of saving a life. But it was the smaller debris that had been the worst. Fragments of stone and metal so tightly packed around his unconscious form that removing them required painstaking care. One wrong move could have driven a shard of metal deeper into his wounds, or brought down another section of unstable ceiling. "I kept talking to you while I worked," she said, her armored hands gentle as they checked his injuries. "Telling you stories about my home, about the festivals we used to hold before the war, about the way our cities looked when the 3 moons rose together over the crystal spires." Her voice took on a distant quality, as if she were speaking from memory rather than present pain. I told you about the warrior's oath we took as children, to protect the innocent, to stand against the darkness, to never abandon those who depended on us. I said the words in my own language first, then translated them for you. I thought if you could hear my voice, maybe you'd fight harder to come back. Crane reached for her hand, his fingers finding the articulated joints of her gauntlet. Even through the armor's bulk, he could feel her trembling. I heard you, he said softly. In the darkness, when everything else was gone, I heard your voice. And that's when I knew, she continued, her words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken inside her. That's when I understood why Commander Voss saved me, why he made me live when I wanted to die with my warriors. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't punishment. It was so I could be here, in this moment, with the strength to pull you from the rubble when no one else could. She leaned closer, and he could see his own reflection in her dark visor, battered and bloodied, but alive. I put the armor back on because without it, you'd see me giving up, she said, and I realized I don't want to give up anymore. Not when there's still someone worth fighting for. Why did you put it back on? He asked, struggling to sit up despite the screaming protest from his injured leg. Because without it, you'd see me giving up, she said, her voice filtered and mechanical through the suit's speakers. And I don't want you to remember me that way. The weight of her words settled on him like a stone. She was preparing to die, he realized, putting on the armor one last time, not for protection, but for dignity, so he would remember the warrior rather than the woman who was falling apart beneath. I won't let you, he said fiercely. You may not have a choice. The communications beacon stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, its antenna array still intact despite everything that had happened below. It was an old model, probably dating back to the original colonization efforts, but it was exactly what Crane needed. Getting there took most of the day. His injured legs slowed them down considerably, forcing frequent rest stops that neither of them could really afford. But Serena never complained, never suggested they abandon the effort. She simply adjusted her pace to match his limitations and kept moving forward. The beacon's power systems had been shut down for months, but its backup generators still held enough charge for basic operations. Crane worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that failure meant death. Not just for them, but for any hope of finding answers about what had been done to Serena's people. The signal, when it finally transmitted, was weak and probably wouldn't reach beyond the planet's immediate orbital space, but it carried their coordinates in a basic medical summary of Serena's condition. If anyone was listening, if anyone cared, they would know where to find them. It's done, Shuyuri, he said, settling back against the beacon's support structure with a sigh of exhaustion. Serena sat nearby, her back against the ridge's rocky wall. Even through the armor's bulk, he could see how much the journey had cost her. Her movements were slower now, more labored. The suit's medical displays painted increasingly urgent warnings in shades of amber and red. He approached her carefully, as if she were some wild creature that might bolt at sudden movement. When she didn't pull away, he took her gloved hand in both of his and placed it against his chest, right over his heart. Do you feel that? He asked. A heartbeat, she said softly. As long as it beats, I won't let you die. And if I die anyway? He squeezed her hand gently, feeling the mechanical articulation of her suit's joints. Then it won't be alone. But not today, Serena. Not today. The ship that arrived the next morning was small and unmarked, the kind of vessel that could slip between patrol routes without attracting attention. Crane watched it descend with a mixture of hope and terror, hope that help had finally arrived, terror that it might be the wrong kind of help entirely. But when the airlock cycled open and a familiar figure stepped onto the planet's surface, Crane felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. Alex, he called out, hardly daring to believe his eyes. Doctor. Alexander Thorne looked exactly the same as he had 2 years ago, when Crane had last seen him on Orbital 6. Middle-aged, slightly rumpled, with the kind of distracted expression that came from spending too much time thinking about problems that had no easy solutions. His medical coat was pristine white against the planet's dusty landscape, making him look impossibly clean and civilized. You survived, Alex said, crossing the distance between them with quick, efficient strides. His eyes were already cataloging Crane's injuries, his medical training taking over. Though I have to say, when I got your transmission, I wasn't entirely surprised. Surprised? Alex's mouth curved into a wry smile as he reached them. You always did have a talent for finding people who needed saving, especially the ones who didn't ask for it. The words hit Crane like a physical blow, carrying him back 2 years to another planet, another crisis. The mining station on Kepler 442b, where a reactor malfunction had trapped 60 workers in the deep shafts. The company had written them off as acceptable losses, but Crane had spent 3 days jury-rigging breathing apparatus and jury-rigging lift systems, refusing to abandon people who had given up hope of rescue. Alex had been there too, part of the emergency medical team that had treated the survivors when Crane finally brought them to the surface. Dehydrated, hypothermic, convinced they were going to die in the darkness, but alive because one stubborn engineer couldn't walk away from voices calling in the deep. That was different, Crane said quietly. Was it? Alex's gaze shifted to Serena, taking in her battered armor and the obvious signs of systemic illness. Let me guess. She told you to leave her, probably more than once. But you stayed anyway because that's who you are. Crane felt heat rise in his cheeks. She saved my life, more than once. I'm sure she did, and I'm equally sure she never asked you to save hers in return. Alex knelt beside Serena, his hands moving with professional competence as he began his examination. You have a gift, Crane. You hear the cries for help that people are too proud or too broken to voice. And this must be your companion, Alex continued, his voice gentling as he addressed Serena directly. She saved my life, Crane said simply. More than once. But she's dying, Alex. There's something wrong with her. Some kind of biological weapon that's eating her alive from the inside. Alex approached Serena with the careful movements of someone accustomed to dealing with traumatized patients. He didn't ask permission before beginning his examination, but his hands were gentle as he checked her armor's medical readouts and assessed her condition through the suit's sensors. It's an old war mutation, he said after several long minutes of analysis. His voice carried the weight of recognition and something that might have been guilt. I've seen it before in laboratory settings. We were working on countermeasures back when the research was still classified. Serena's helmet turned toward him with mechanical precision. Countermeasures? An antidote, Alex confirmed. The chances of success are not encouraging. The disease is too well established, too integrated with your body's systems, but it exists. Crane felt his heart skip a beat. After everything they'd been through, after watching her slowly fade away, despite all his efforts, there might actually be hope. But Serena was shaking her head. I'm not worthy of saving, she said, her voice flat and mechanical. I led my people into a trap. I failed them all. Crane stepped forward, taking her armored hands in his. Even through the gloves, he could feel how cold she was, how fragile despite the suit's bulk. Then I'm not worthy of living, he said fiercely, because if you die, a part of me dies with you, and I'm not ready for that. She stared at him for a long moment, and he wished desperately that he could see her face. Finally, she began the slow process of removing her helmet, each seal disengaging with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure. When she was finally revealed, her face was streaked with tears, the first he'd seen her shed. They cut clean tracks through the grime and exhaustion, making her look younger and more human than he'd ever seen her. All right, she whispered. All right. The process of removing the armor was like watching someone shed their skin. Each piece came away slowly, carefully, revealing more of the woman hidden beneath the warrior's shell. Without the bulk of the suit, she looked impossibly fragile, all sharp angles and hollow spaces where muscle should have been. But she was also, undeniably, beautiful. Not in the way that fashion magazines or entertainment vids define beauty, but in the way that survived things were beautiful. Scars became stories written on skin, and weakness became a kind of honesty that was rarer than strength. Now you see everything, she said, standing before them in simple undergarments, every flaw and vulnerability on display. Yes, Crane answered, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. And you're still the most beautiful person I've ever seen. She broke then, years of held-back tears finally finding release. Alex administered the injection while she cried, the antidote entering her system with nothing more dramatic than a brief sting. But Crane could see the hope in Alex's eyes, the cautious optimism of a doctor who thought his patient might actually have a chance. Now we wait, Alex said, settling back on his heels. The treatment will either work or it won't. There's nothing more we can do except monitor her progress and hope her body can remember how to heal itself. Crane sat beside her as she fell into the first peaceful sleep he'd seen her have. Her breathing was still labored, but there was something different about it. Less desperate, perhaps. More like someone resting than someone dying. He held her hand and watched the alien constellations turn overhead, counting heartbeats and measuring breaths, and refusing to let himself think about failure. 3 weeks later, she stepped onto the medical facility's observation deck barefoot and dressed in simple civilian clothes. Her hair, clean and loose around her shoulders, caught the artificial sunlight like spun gold. The blue veins were still visible beneath her skin, but they no longer looked like fractures in marble. They looked like rivers feeding life back into drought-stricken land. "I dream now," she said, joining him at the railing that overlooked the facility's gardens. "Real dreams, not fever visions. And there's no pain in them." "That means you're healing," Crane said, though he'd already known that from watching her these past weeks. The change had been gradual but unmistakable. Color returning to her skin, strength flowing back into wasted muscles, the terrible brittleness leaving her movements. She turned to face him, and in her hands was a familiar weight, her old armor, compressed into a neat bundle that somehow looked smaller and less threatening than he remembered. "I don't have to wear this anymore," she said, holding it up between them like an offering. He took her free hand, marveling at the warmth of her skin, the steady pulse beneath his fingertips. "What do you want to do with it?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the armor that had been both prison and protection for so many years. "I want to bury it," she said finally. "Not destroy it. It saved my life too many times for that. But I want to put it to rest. Let it sleep in the earth like the warrior I used to be." They found a place in the facility's memorial garden, beneath a tree that Alex had told them was native to Earth, brought here as a seedling and nurtured into something that could survive in alien soil. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Crane used his engineering tools to dig the grave, his movements careful and deliberate despite the crutch he still needed for his injured leg. Serena knelt beside the hole, running her fingers over each piece of armor one last time. "You were faithful," she whispered to the metal, her voice carrying the weight of a funeral prayer. "You carried me when I couldn't carry myself. You protected me when I had no strength left to protect myself. You made me strong when I had forgotten what strength meant." She placed each piece into the earth with reverent care. The chest plate that had monitored her failing heart, the gauntlets that had steadied her trembling hands, the helmet that had hidden her tears from a world that expected warriors to be unbreakable. The visor went in last, that dark mirror that had reflected so much pain and fear and finally hope. They covered it together, piling dark soil over polished metal until nothing remained but a small mound beneath the alien tree. Serena placed a single white stone on top, a tradition from her homeworld, she explained, marking the grave of a warrior who had died with honor. "Is that what this is?" Crane asked. "A death?" "No," she said, rising to her feet and brushing dirt from her hands. "It's a transformation. The warrior is dead, but the woman lives." The next morning, they left the facility together as the artificial dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Crane moved slowly on his crutch, the injury to his leg having healed badly despite Alex's best efforts. But he didn't mind the limitation. It was a reminder of what he'd survived, what they'd survived together. Serena walked beside him barefoot, her civilian clothes simple and practical, but somehow elegant in their very ordinariness. She carried a small pack with their few possessions, but her hands were free, unencumbered by weapons or armor or the weight of a warrior's duty. The transport that would take them to the next orbital station waited on the landing pad ahead, but neither of them hurried toward it. There would be time for destinations later, time for new worlds and new purposes. For now, there was just the morning air on their faces and the knowledge that they were no longer alone. "Where do we go from here?" Serena asked as they walked. "Forward," Crane replied, adjusting his grip on the crutch and matching his pace to hers. "Together." She smiled. That full, genuine expression that still transformed her face completely, erasing years of pain and replacing them with something that was definitely joy now, no longer just the possibility of it. Behind them, the medical facility's towers caught the light like spears thrust into the morning sky. Ahead, the transport waited with doors open and engines warming. And between past and future, Two survivors walked toward whatever came next. The warrior was dead, buried beneath alien soil and native earth. But the woman lived and learned to dream again, and walked barefoot into the dawn beside someone who had heard her silent cry for help when she couldn't voice it herself. Sometimes, Crane thought as they reached the transport and he felt Serena's hand slip into his, beginnings were not just enough. Sometimes they were everything.